On the 16th of July 1940, General Josef Beppo Schmidt, Chief of Luftwaffe Intelligence, signed out an assessment of British air strength. Schmidt estimated that both the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane were inferior to the Luftwaffe's twin-engine Bf-110 heavy fighter. He failed to mention Britain's radar capabilities. He entirely missed the nature of Britain's air defence system. He miscalculated the rate of British fighter production, and he concluded with a line that would age catastrophically. The Luftwaffe, unlike the RAF, would be in a position in every respect to achieve a decisive effect this year. Within weeks, combat over southern England was shredding that assumption. The aircraft Schmidt called superior to both British fighters was, in practice, far less dominant than the paper assessment suggested. Schmidt's failures weren't personal eccentricity. They were structural. Luftwaffe air intelligence before and during the Battle of Britain was seriously flawed, and the planning built on it was just as optimistic. Goering's directives assumed the RAF could be attacked at every favourable opportunity and destroyed quickly. Early estimates suggested Fighter Command might be beaten in 4 days, with a few more weeks enough to finish the rest of the RAF and Britain's aircraft industry. What filtered down from above was shaped by that optimism. Schmidt's July assessment understated British strengths and overrated German advantages. Luftwaffe planners also missed that Dowding had held much of Fighter Command back rather than exposing it all on forward airfields. German commanders entered the campaign without a clear picture of the enemy they were trying to defeat. Against that institutional backdrop, German fighter pilots entered 1940 with a different kind of knowledge. 3 straight years of combat experience. And that experience told them they were winning. Werner Mulders arrived in Spain on April 14, 1938, assigned to 3. Staffel of Jagdgruppe 88 in the Condor Legion, the unit commanded at that point by Adolf Galland. Mulders took over the squadron on the 24th of May when Galland rotated home. Flying the Bf-109 against Soviet-built Polikarpov 116s and 115s over the Valencia-Ebro front, he claimed his first aerial victory near Algar on July 15, 1938, a Polikarpov 115. By the time he left Spain on December 5th, his confirmed tally stood at 14, 2 115, 11 116 and 1 Tupolev SB bomber. Back in Germany, Mulders was assigned to the Inspector of Fighters at the Ministry of Aviation in Berlin. His task? Devise new fighter pilot tactics based on Spanish experience. What he formalized changed air combat across the Luftwaffe. The Finger 4 formation, the Schwarm, replaced the tight V-shaped sections inherited from the previous war. 2 fighters flew as a rotor, leader and wingman, separated by roughly 200 yards. 2 Rotten made a Schwarm, 4 aircraft spread abreast like fingertips of an outstretched hand. Every pilot could scan the sky. Every pilot could cover his wingmate's blind spot. The wide lateral spacing meant formations climbed faster than tightly grouped aircraft, reduced the risk of mid-air collision, and made the Schwarm harder to spot from a distance. When flying as a Staffel, 3 Schwarmer staggered in height and wove back and forth for mutual protection. By September 1939, Mulders was commanding the 3rd Jagdgeschwader 53, and his tactics were spreading through the Jagdwaffe. His first victory of the war came on September 20th, a Curtiss P-36 of the French Groupe de Chasse 2/5 destroyed between Contes and Sierck at the Three Borders area. He later described taking off with his Schwarm to intercept 6 enemy monoplanes reported south of Trier, climbing above them in a wide curve and diving on the rearmost machine. By the end of the phony war, his personal tally stood at 9. 3 Curtiss Hawks, 2 Morane Saunier MS-406s, 4 Hawker Hurricanes. On the 22nd of December 1939, leading 4 Bf-109s from 3/JG-53, he and wingman Hans von Hahn shot down 2 Hurricanes over the Saar River between Metz and Thionville, the first confirmed Hurricane kills by German fighters. None of Mulder's opponents in those months were Spitfires. Galland had a different path into the same cockpit. A ground attack pilot in Spain, he'd flown Heinkel H-51 biplanes in close support missions, and only transitioned to fighters after making 10 flights in the Bf-109 before leaving the Condor Legion in May 1938. The aircraft's performance convinced him to switch roles. But he spent the first months of the European War still flying ground attack, leading 2nd Schlacht/Lehrgeschwader II over Poland. It wasn't until early 1940 that he persuaded his superiors to let him become a fighter pilot. On June 5, 1940, he took command of the 3rd JG-26. The Battle of France ran through both men like a fire. The Luftwaffe lost 30% of its bomber force, 30% of its dive bombers, 40% of its transport aircraft, and nearly 20% of its Bf-109s in barely 6 weeks. Over 15% of the single-engine fighter pilot corps were killed or missing. Nearly half of all surviving Luftwaffe aircraft had been damaged on active operations. The RAF's losses were comparable. 950 aircraft total, roughly half its frontline strength, including 386 Hurricanes and 67 Spitfires. But to the surviving German pilots, France was confirmation. Historian Williamson Murray describes the mood on the continent as euphoric. The fundamental assumption virtually all Germans were working under was that Britain was through, and all they needed was to persuade the recalcitrant British to see the realities of their situation. Nobody in Goering's Luftwaffe bureaucracies recognized that major production increases were needed. The people who had so cravenly surrendered at Munich, in the German High Command's reading, would surely recognize reality now. The Spitfire, during all of this, had barely registered. At Dowding's insistence, Spitfire squadrons remained based in Britain throughout the French campaign. They flew sorties across the Channel to cover the Dunkirk evacuation, but never deployed to continental airfields. The Luftwaffe's primary RAF opponents in France had been Hurricanes. For most German fighter pilots, the Spitfire was a name on an intelligence summary, not a memory in the muscles. One early encounter came on May 13, 1940. That day, Spitfires met German fighters over the Low Countries in one of the type's earliest clashes of the campaign. A contemporary account later noted that in those earliest encounters, both sides were still feeling their way in the development of fighter tactics. 10 days later, the Spitfire arrived in force over Dunkirk. From 23rd May onward, Spitfires found themselves ranged against the Luftwaffe in mass encounters during the evacuation. On that date, Spitfires of No. 54 Squadron became the first to shoot down Bf-109s over Calais-Marc airfield on the French coast. Flying officer Alan Deer was credited with 2, some sources say 1 destroyed and 1 probable, and pilot officer Johnny Allen claimed a 3rd. The Kracker Luftwaffe archive records a German pilot's first victory as a Spitfire northwest of Calais on 28 May 1940, placing both sides in lethal contact across the Channel approaches within days of each other. The Luftwaffe Fightergruppen, JG-26, JG-51, JG-27, and their attached formations, typically patrolled in group strength of 30 to 40 aircraft, meeting RAF squadrons of just 12. On 24 May, 2/JG-26 destroyed 3 No. 74 Squadron Spitfires attacking German bombers without loss. On 29 May, 2 Gruppen of JG-26 and 3/JG-3 caught British formations that were too far apart and dived from higher altitude into the gap. In 30 minutes, 10 British fighters went down, while Stukas hammered Dunkirk shipping below. Numerically, the Jagdwaffe was winning over Dunkirk, but the aircraft they were fighting didn't handle like the French Marines and Curtiss Hawks that had preceded them. The Bf-109E and the Spitfire Mark I were close in almost every measurable dimension. Top speed differed by roughly 7 to 10 miles per hour. German data showed the Me-109E between 342 and 348 miles per hour. The Spitfire Mark I, with armoured windscreen and constant speed propeller, reached 354 to 359 miles per hour, depending on altitude and boost setting. Climb rate was nearly identical below 20,000 feet. Both aircraft reached the combat altitudes of the day within acceptable time. The German fighter had real advantages. Its Daimler-Benz DB601 engine used direct fuel injection, meaning it didn't starve under -G the way the Spitfire's float-carburetted Merlin did. A Bf-109 pilot could bunt into a dive and hold full power, while the Spitfire pilot felt his engine cough and die. The Emil also accelerated faster in the opening seconds of a steep dive, pulling away before a pursuing Spitfire could match the rate. At low altitude, the DB601's supercharger delivered roughly 200 horsepower more than the Spitfire Mark I's Merlin III. But in a turning fight, the kind of engagement that happened when neither pilot could break away cleanly, when the merge had been too close and both aircraft were circling, pulling G, each trying to get inside the other's arc, the Spitfire held an advantage the Luftwaffe's broad pre-battle picture had not captured. The evidence for this comes from the most thorough comparative test available in the period. A Bf-109E3, Werk number 1304, had been captured intact on November 22, 1939, when its pilot, Oberfeldwebel Karl Heer of 1/JG-76, lost direction and mistakenly landed on the French airfield at Strasbourg-Wörth in Alsace. The undamaged aircraft was evaluated first by the French Centre d'Essai du Matériel Aérien at Orléans-Brissy, where it was compared against a Devoitin D520, a Bloch MB152, and one Spitfire Mark I received from the British. It was then flown to England in May 1940, transferred from Chartres to Tangmere by Flight Officer Hilly Brown of No. 1 Squadron, and handed to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. The British gave it serial AE479, repainted it, and over 35 flying hours and 78 separate flights put the Emil through every handling scenario they could devise, including direct dogfights against Hurricanes and Spitfires. The RAE's September 1940 Handling and Maneuverability Report judged the Me-109 inferior as a fighter to the Hurricane and Spitfire, citing heavy controls at high speeds, high wing loading, and a poor turning circle. The numbers made the abstract concrete. Minimum radius of turn without height loss at 12,000 feet full throttle, 885 feet for the Bf-109. For the Spitfire, 696 feet. Under realistic combat conditions, if a Bf-109 sat behind a Spitfire and both entered a sustained turn, the Spitfire could work its way onto the 109's tail within good shooting distance, roughly 250 yards, after about 7.5 turns. That sequence took approximately 2 minutes. A Hurricane could do it faster. The report measured something else German pilots could feel at the stick, but had no numbers for. At 400 miles per hour, a Bf-109 pilot, exerting all his strength, could apply only about 1/5 aileron deflection, banking 45 degrees in roughly 4 seconds. The Spitfire, at the same speed, managed only 1/5 deflection too. But the explanation lay in cockpit geometry, not aerodynamics. The Spitfire's stick travel was roughly 8 inches of lateral movement. The 109's was 4. The Spitfire cockpit was wide enough for a pilot to swing his arm and bear down with his shoulder. The Bf-109's cockpit was so cramped the pilot couldn't bring his arm into the position most favorable for applying a large sideways force. The RAE estimated a Spitfire pilot could push about 60 pounds sideways. A 109 pilot managed roughly 40. At the combat speeds of 300 miles per hour, where most turning fights happened, the Spitfire rolled faster into the turn, entered the arc sooner, and began pulling inside the 109 before the German pilot had completed his own bank. There was a further asymmetry buried beneath the headline performance figures. The Bf-109 had no rudder trimmer adjustable in flight. At 215 miles per hour, the aircraft was trimmed directionally, no rudder input needed. Above that speed, increasing left rudder was required to fly straight. At 300 miles per hour, roughly 2 degrees of left rudder were needed, and the force required to hold even that amount was exhausting. The RAE report was specific. At high speeds, the Bf-109 turned more readily to the right than to the left, because the pilot simply couldn't spare the leg strength to coordinate a left turn while also pulling back on the stick. In the aerial geometry over the channel, where a left or right brake was chosen in a fraction of a second, this kind of detail sat well below the Luftwaffe's already flawed picture of the fight. The Bf-109 had a design feature meant to help in exactly this kind of fight: automatic leading edge slats. As the wing approached stall in a tight turn, the slats deployed forward along roughly 46% of the span, re-energizing airflow and allowing the pilot to hold a tighter arc without departing into a spin. The Bf-109's stall behavior, with slats extended, was gentle. No violent snap roll, no sudden departure. The RAE acknowledged that this mattered because it let the Luftwaffe pilot get close to the limit in a circling dogfight. In practice, the slats created problems that only surfaced under the pressure of real combat. They deployed based on local airflow conditions and in the turbulence of a tight turn, changing angles of attack, disturbed air behind another aircraft. The slats opened and closed asymmetrically. The wing on the inside of the turn might deploy its slat while the outside wing didn't, causing the 109 to buck and throw off the pilot's aim at the exact moment he was trying to hold a firing solution. Multiple German pilot accounts suggest that many Luftwaffe novices treated the slat deployment as a warning to ease back rather than push through. They regarded the point at which the slats popped out as the aircraft's limit. Only the most experienced pilots understood they could ride the asymmetric deployment and keep turning. Even for those pilots, the intermittent snatching made sustained gun tracking unreliable during the tightest part of the turn. The Spitfire had no slats. Mitchell's elliptical wing used roughly 2.5 degrees of washout, a built-in twist giving the root a higher angle of incidence than the tip. As the aircraft approached its limit in a tight turn, the root stalled first. The result was a shuddering vibration through the entire airframe, accompanied in official handling notes by a violent shudder and clattering noise. The pilot felt it in his hands, his seat, his spine. It was feedback, unmistakable, progressive and honest, telling him he was riding the edge without snatching control away. The ailerons, mounted near the wingtips where the airflow was still clean, remained effective. The Spitfire warned its pilot. The 109's slats could unsettle a pilot's aim at the worst possible moment. British testing in September 1940 revealed a counterintuitive detail. Some Bf 109 pilots succeeded in keeping on the tail of the Spitfire despite the Spitfire's superior turning performance, because a number of Spitfire pilots failed to tighten up the turn sufficiently. They felt the buffet and eased off, leaving more room in the turn than the aircraft actually needed. The advantage was there, but it required pilots who trusted the machine enough to stay in the shudder. As experience accumulated through July and August, more RAF pilots learned to ride the edge, and the 109's turning disadvantage hardened into a reliable tactical reality. Given all this, what did German pilots actually say when they found themselves in the middle of it? Günther Rall, who would eventually claim 275 victories and become one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced combat pilots, reflected on the Spitfire in post-war interviews. He noted that the wing of the Spitfire was very stable in a turning fight, a clinical, aerodynamic observation that captured something German pilots learned through repetition. The elliptical wing maintained its lift distribution across the span in a way that gave the aircraft honest, predictable handling at the outer edge of its envelope. A pilot could ride the buffet and keep pulling, and the aircraft responded without surprises. The most famous remark attributed to Galland came during a visit from Goering to the Channel front. In the widely repeated version, Goering asked his senior fighter leaders what they needed to win the battle, and Galland answered that he wanted a squadron of Spitfires for his Geschwader. The precise date and wording of that exchange remain debated, but Galland's own explanation of the remark was consistent across retellings. He was emphasizing that flying the Bf 109, while forced into tactics suited to the Spitfire, close escort of bombers, tight weaving above slow formations, sustained proximity flying at speeds far below the 109's optimum, was a disadvantage the Luftwaffe's own strategy had imposed. The 109 could beat the Spitfire in the vertical. It could outrun it in a dive. It couldn't sit in a sustained turning fight with it and win. That last point matters for evaluating the historical record honestly. Much of the pilot testimony available today comes from post-war memoirs and interviews conducted years or decades after 1940. Rall's observations and Galland's anecdote are retrospective. They compress many encounters into distilled impressions. No reproduced German combat report from mid-1940 has been found in available sources that describes, blow by blow, a pilot's first turning fight with a Spitfire, and the moment he realized the paper picture was wrong. The dated combat claims from the Kraker Luftwaffe archive confirm that German pilots were engaging and claiming Spitfires from 28 May 1940 onward, northwest of Calais, south of Folkestone, across the Channel approaches. But the internal experience of the encounter is filtered through memory. A lesson that took 5 or 10 engagements to crystallize becomes the first time I met the Spitfire in later telling. This doesn't mean the testimony is false. It means the moment of realization wasn't a single cinematic event. It was cumulative, built across sorties, across weeks, across dozens of encounters in which German pilots discovered, piece by piece, that the aircraft across the circle was holding a tighter arc, rolling into turns faster, and refusing to fall behind when both machines were bleeding speed at 12,000 feet. One detail complicates the standard Spitfire narrative, and German pilots knew it firsthand. The Hurricane equipped 32 Fighter Command squadrons during the Battle of Britain. The Spitfire equipped 19. On any given day, a Bf 109 pilot scrambling to sweep ahead of a bomber formation was more likely to encounter Hurricanes than Spitfires. Fighter Command's preferred approach was to send Hurricanes against the bombers and Spitfires against the escort fighters. But the air over southern England was chaotic enough that clean divisions rarely held. The distinction mattered to the Jagdwaffe. The Hurricane was larger, slightly slower, and identifiable by its thicker wing profile and the fabric covering behind its cockpit. Both British fighters could turn inside a 109, but the Spitfire was faster, more agile at altitude, and significantly harder to disengage from once a turning fight began. Some German pilots, especially early in the battle, misidentified one for the other. In the middle of a high-speed merge, with aircraft turning in every direction and the fight collapsing into contrails and muzzle flash, the difference between a Hurricane and a Spitfire might not become clear until the turn began, and the aircraft on the tail refused to fall behind. As combats multiplied over the Channel and southeast England, Jagdwaffe tactics adapted in the obvious direction. High-speed diving attacks from altitude, a fast-firing pass, then a zoom climb or extension using the 109's steeper angle of climb and the fuel injection advantage that let the engine hold power through a bunt. Arrive from above and behind, fire, pull away, climb, reset, stay in the vertical, stay fast. If a Spitfire turned into you and you couldn't get a deflection shot, don't follow it around. Break off, dive. The turning fight was ceded to the Spitfire not because German pilots lacked nerve, but because the physics of the engagement didn't reward nerve. They rewarded wing loading and turn radius, and the width of a cockpit and the strength in a pilot's arms. This was the opposite of what Goering demanded. He wanted his fighters close to the bombers, weaving above the formations, staying in visual contact. That meant flying slowly. That meant turning. That meant fighting on the Spitfire's terms. Gallen's frustration was shared across the Jagdwaffe. The 109 was being used wrong. Its strength was speed and altitude. Its commander-in-chief was ordering patience and proximity. The broader intelligence failure amplified the problem at every level. Schmidt's branch continued to underestimate British fighter strength through August. On the 17th of August, German intelligence suggested the RAF was down to just 300 serviceable fighters. The frontline pilots could see the sky filling with Spitfires and Hurricanes every sortie, aircraft that the larger intelligence picture kept insisting should be fewer than they were. On September 15, 1940, now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, RAF formations, including 12 Spitfire squadrons, separated the Bf 109 escorts from the bomber streams. Every fighter Keith Park could put in the air was engaged. The war in the air over the Channel wasn't lost because the Bf 109 was a bad aircraft. It was one of the finest single-seat fighters of the entire war. Fast in the vertical, lethal from altitude, and deadly in the hands of a pilot who understood its strengths. What the summer of 1940 exposed was something narrower and more important. Luftwaffe intelligence had badly underestimated the RAF, misunderstood Britain's air defence system, and even rated the Spitfire below the Bf 110. Combat then forced a correction paper had not supplied. Over the Channel and southern England, German pilots learned that the Spitfire wasn't just another British fighter. In the turn, it was a very serious opponent. That is the clearest answer the evidence supports. Not a single perfect first contact scene preserved in one combat report, and not a neat briefing sheet myth shattered in one merge. But a flawed intelligence picture met repeated combat reality, and the reality won. Over the Channel in the summer of 1940, those assumptions met the Spitfire's elliptical wing at 300 miles per hour. The war in the air wouldn't be fought according to Berlin's paper estimates. It would be fought according to the physics of two aircraft in a circle. If you enjoyed this, subscribe for more stories from inside the cockpit.